I'm doing my project on the Angolan Civil War, but I'm doing it from like a sort of unique perspective, where I'm looking at the war, but from the perspective of foreign powers that are intervening in the war and providing aid, and looking at why they did that and how it affects the outcome of the war. And I believe that the presence of foreign intervention and all the aid that they were giving to both sides of the war was sort of taking a war that could have ended very quickly and dragging it out over a much longer period of time. But before I get into that, I'm gonna give just a very brief background on the war. Portugal colonized Angola in the 15th century. Angola would remain a Portuguese colony until 1975. Angola had sort of been resisting colonialism for quite a while before they finally gained their independence. There's several major movements in Angola resisting the Portuguese. The most significant ones were the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or what I'm going to refer to as the MPLA, the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, or the FNLA, and the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA. Interestingly enough, though, the final nail in the coffin of the Portuguese Empire in Africa was an event that didn't really happen in Africa, but back in Portugal. The Portuguese had been sort of fighting to maintain their colonies for a really long time, and certain people in Portugal were getting really tired of this. They got tired of expending all of these resources in Africa to maintain their colonies, and several military officials actually staged a coup against the government to overthrow the Caetano regime, which was the president or prime minister of Angola at the time. So he was leading the country, and they believed he was leading it very badly by wasting all these resources. And they replaced it with a new government led by a former general, Antonio de Spinola. I think I said that right, but I probably didn't. Spinola had previously spoke out against fighting in Africa, and 4 months later, after he finally takes office, he does begin the process of granting independence to all of these colonies. The MPLA was formed in the 50s to resist the Portuguese. It was led by a guy named Agostinho Neto. I probably said that wrong as well. The MPLA was a Marxist, Soviet-backed organization in Angola. So one of the communist, I don't want to say powers, but communist factions in Angola. The FNLA and the UNITA were both backed by the United States for the majority of the war. Not really because they shared the same beliefs as the United States necessarily, but more so because they were willing to work with the United States, and the United States wanted access to Angola's very rich resources. When Angola did finally gain its independence, the Portuguese and the three factions that I just talked about signed the Alvor Agreement, which is a three-way power-sharing agreement between the factions, which, if worked, would have been a nice way to avoid conflict, but it falls apart not really that long after it's signed. The MPLA was being sent aid by the Soviets, and the United States started sending aid to the FNLA and UNITA. Both nations, the Soviets and the United States, wanted to have more control over Angola to gain access to the resources and all the wealth over there. They had a lot of mineral wealth and some oil as well. The Soviets sort of needed more influence in Africa, or they thought they needed more influence in Africa, because the United States, like we talked about in class, had secured a lot of influence over the Congo, or Zaire at the time, when they couped a former administration there as well. So the United States is really trying to exert its control, but this is only a couple years after Vietnam, which went very poorly for the United States, and they committed a lot of soldiers to it. So the United States government was very weary to do that. They didn't really want to. But they were still operating under domino theory, which is essentially, well, if this country falls, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one. So if Angola fell, then maybe the Congo would be next. And if the Congo fell, then maybe South Africa would be next. So they couldn't really put soldiers in Angola, but they could definitely send a lot of money and supplies to Angola to decide they wanted to win in Angola. And they were afraid they'd start losing the Congo, which has a lot of wealth, one of the wealthiest nations in sub-Saharan Africa, mineral-wise, and just resources in general. Despite being on 3 different factions, they weren't all that different. Like I said, the MPLA was a Marxist faction, but they weren't super into that. They were, but they weren't fanatically for it. All of the factions, their primary thing that they wanted was just the independence and sovereignty of Angola, and to control Angola, I should say. They all wanted it to be their sovereign Angola. Every country got involved for different reasons. More than just the U.S. and the Soviets, though, is Cuba, Zaire, which is the Congo. South Africa as well would get involved. The apartheid government in South Africa at the time was involved because there was a organization called SWAPO, which wasn't a part of necessarily the Angolan Civil War, but they're there. They're being based by the MPLA. The MPLA is helping them out. What they wanted was the independence of Namibia, and they'd been fighting for that since 1960, which is 15 years before even Angola got independence, and they've been fighting the South Africans for that. So South Africa had an interest in rooting them out in MPLA territory. Zaire was actually, the president of Zaire was related to the leader of the FNLA through marriage. So that's one of the reasons he got involved. But Zaire also wanted to secure some oil fields in eastern Angola. And for a long time in 1975, by late October of 1975, actually, the MPLA had been pushed back severely. Despite the Soviet aid, the United States was sending aid to the FNLA and UNITA, which were fighting on the same side. And it looked like they were going to lose. But then the Cubans started throwing aid at them. So this is one of the times in which I said earlier that the war is getting drawn out, where it looked like the MPLA they were going to lose. It's what it looked like. That's what anyone would have said at the time. The MPLA's leadership, Agostinho Neto writes the Cuban leadership and Fidel Castro asking for more assistance and supplies. He writes this letter asking for 10 things, including establishing military schools and training soldiers, for more uniforms and equipment, weapons and financial support, as well as schools teaching Marxism, which the Cuban leadership sort of looked at this in an anti-imperialist way. Obviously, they were colonized by Spain, not Portugal. But they eventually gained their independence, and they're influenced by the United States for a while before breaking away. So they're sort of used to being influenced by other nations and dominated by other nations in many ways. So they're looking at this in an anti-imperialist, global socialist revolution type of way. So the MPLA clearly is playing into that, and it works very successfully. By January of 1976, a little over 10 to 12,000 Cuban combat troops began fighting in Angola. This was more than enough to begin turning the tide in favor of the MPLA. And unfortunately for the UNITA and the FNLA, the United States Congress passes the Clark Amendment in 1976, which basically bans all covert funding to Angola because they had been doing this secretly, and the Congress says they're not allowed to do that anymore. But the Soviets also start ramping up their support for the MPLA, And it doesn't take long for, by 1976, the FNLA and UNITA are almost entirely defeated. And the war sort of calms down for a couple of years. It's not over necessarily, but it's calmed down quite a lot. And in 1981, under the Reagan administration, it picks up because the Reagan administration had sort of taken a much more hard line against their Cold War enemies and rivals. So they want to send aid to gain more influence once again. And they have the Clark Amendment completely repealed. And they begin sending aid to the UNITA to rearm. And it's enough for the UNITA, which the UNITA sort of absorbs the FNLA at this time. They become like completely one faction. They've been fighting on the same side, but they weren't one side. Now they are one side of the war, completely. Same organization now. The Soviets have been sending billions of dollars to the MPLA, and South Africa was still fighting SWAPO at this time, so they're still involved. Zaire is still involved a little bit, but not as hard as they were before. So they're stuck fighting each other now because they're both being funded by the Soviets and the United States in what a war that should have ended like 5 years ago and was close to ending again. But the aid does start to stop a little bit eventually as well. Well, from South Africa, the United States sort of uses Namibian independence to get Cuban troops out of South Africa. They negotiate. They're like, well, if Cuba gets out of here, we'll give Namibia independence. Which, like I said, the Cubans were looking at this from like an anti-imperialist way. And in their eyes, South Africa was an imperialist nation controlling Namibia. So this is a big diplomatic win for them. And the Cubans leave. They agree to this. And Namibia is granted independence. South Africa is taken out of the war. And that happens in 1989. And 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapses completely. And so they're obviously not sending aid anymore because they can't afford it. The modern Russia couldn't afford it at the time. And the Soviet Union obviously collapsed. So the Soviet Union is no more at this point. So that obviously ends their support. Now, the United States loses as much interest in this as they had before, but they're still aiding the UNITA. But it's not like they care enough to really send a lot of aid. Just enough to keep the war going for another decade. Losing. They don't win. They send all this aid. They don't win. Because they've lost interest. So they're still sending, they're like, you can have a little bit, but we don't really care if you win all that much. And the UNITA fights like this brutal guerrilla war for another decade until they eventually surrender in 2002 and their leader dies. So sort of what I'm getting at here is the large amount of aid that they're sending to both sides, the Soviets and the United States. It's keeping a war going that should have ended many times. Like in 2 years after it started, the FNLA is almost done. The same year it started, the MPLA is almost done. And then in the 80s, it should have been over, but then they start sending even more aid because they care again because they're losing. And it's just this back and forth that should have not gone on nearly this long. And I believe it's largely due to the aid being sent to them. Obviously, they would have still fought without the aid, probably, although it's possible they wouldn't have, because they might not have thought they had enough advantage over each other, and they might have just stuck with the Alvor Agreement. But the aid maybe helped start the war, but it definitely prolonged it, and that's sort of what I'm trying to get at here.